As a performer, your body is there.
Hi, I'm Mad Kate, and you're listening to S.W.E.A.T. Sexuality, Work, Extraction, Art, Theatrics. S.W.E.A.T. is a series of conversations about performance and performativity of the sexual and sexualized body at work, where work is broadly defined as the labor of survival, the labor of care, creativity, and capital A art. How exactly do we define our work? And how does that work entangle and circumscribe our sexual identities, our creative lives, and the ways in which we provide care? How do we perform? Tasks, acts of care, and identities. Anchored in our always already racialized and sexualized bodies, our complex intersectionalities, these conversations are a means of relating through work to each other. I hope that they contribute to dialogues which normalize sex work and all work as deserving of respect, healthy conditions, and a living wage.
When it comes to basic income, the idea is just that people will have the power to say no to different forms of relationships. Say no to a job, say no to an abusive partnership, and to say yes to the things that you want.
This month's conversation is with author, activist, and economic anthropologist Julio Linares. His first book, Decolonizing Money, will be out on Pluto Press in 2025. He argues for the abolition of the US dollar as a means to transform the distribution of wealth and power on the planet in order to bring forth a social, ecological, just transition.
Learning from anarcho-feminists about how to move the pelvis has been very powerful for me. It's a tool as part of many tools in the toolbox to fight things like patriarchy and colonization. Like, I was socialized to be a man, masculinity that is not supposed to move those parts of the body.
Since 2018, Julio has served as public outreach for the Basic Income Earth Network. He's also helped organize 2 pilot programs of universal basic income in Taiwan and in Berlin-Brandenburg.
I think since I was young, I was always working, maybe not for a wage, but doing all sorts of work, mostly for other people. We were discussing with a friend of mine from Guatemala how in our culture we are taught to serve others and to always give and to give and to give. And it often almost seems like this kind of care work, it helps in many ways, many people, but at the same time, if you keep doing it a lot, and especially in the context of feminized bodies, becomes a way to even get meaning out of things. So I feel like ever since a young age, I was always caring for others, doing lots of this type of works. And then, this relationship between giving and receiving has become more important recently, I think, for me.
What was the first time that you felt like you had an identity as a worker? Like, I am a... And what was that identity?
I feel like it changes in different places. In Guatemala, I did many sorts of small gig works. I think anything from working at service places, serving other people, food, cooking, call centers. In Guatemala, we have a lot of call centers. We answer calls in English for people from the US because it's cheaper to do it, I guess, for them. So definitely there I felt like a worker. Then in Asia, I lived in Taiwan for 6 years, and there I was studying, but I was also working as a teacher, English teacher, math teacher, Spanish teacher. And that was also strange because I had to hide my worker identity because I was, on the one hand, like working black money with cash. And at the same time, since I'm not a native English speaker, I had to lie to my bosses that I was some sort of person from the US, even though I have nothing to do with that country. And then here in Germany, also as a worker, I think the history of work struggles in Germany is definitely very alive and present. And so there is a more, I would say, thicker consciousness about what it means to be a worker here, a migrant worker here, in a context where, most of the city basically in Berlin is run by migrants, either for, cleaning jobs or for service work, even for technology work. And with the work I was doing here in Berlin, organizing a basic income pilot, I got to, work a lot with other workers and also understand their different contexts and their struggles. So I think this identity of what it means to be a worker has changed in the different contexts I am in, either in Guatemala, working for the empire, in the call center, for example, or working for Taiwanese people, teaching English to their children, or here. It's here in Germany, I feel like it's also that work takes so much of people's time, and we are kind of colonized by the calendar here. So yeah, I feel like it's very important also not to confuse, our lives with work also. And I think many people do that, including myself.
What is the distinction between life and work? Like, what is that relationship?
Yeah, I feel like it's the biggest lie that capitalism has ever sold us, that we live to work, or we are, our lives are meaningful only because we work for a wage. I think especially important to distinguish it because most of the stuff that we do is not wage work. It's actually caring for other people. I think especially in Europe, people are in this cycle of trying to produce meaning. Like, often feels like as if capitalism has like taking the means of the production of meaning away from us. So I think making that distinction that, our work is not our life is very important.
In what areas of work do you feel a sense of meaning?
I think in the little actions that I do to take care of myself, to take care of others, whether if it's, cooking for myself or cooking for other people in like self-organized places here, talking to people, listening to people. I personally do a lot of non-wage work that is related to massage, and which involves touch, feeling into how's their body, how's their back, and then the mutual satisfaction that comes from like releasing pain and ache, stress, suffering in the back. I find that super nice and super meaningful.
It's interesting, like when I hear about work that also involves the body, I find it interesting to think about how the perception instantly changes around that work, like as opposed to the other work I know about you as a writer, as an activist. Like sometimes I feel like we carry around in those other jobs. Some of us almost don't have a body in those other contexts sometimes. Whereas in work that's very clearly physical, somatic, then suddenly it's like, oh yes, I have a body. I'm thinking about how my body feels.
Like when it comes to writing, it's interesting that you say it as a form of work, right? Because it's mostly like thinking and sitting down and, using your hands, right? Using your body as well to like produce something. I think that is an interesting way in which, especially through like all these information technologies, computers, we've been like colonized to believe that we don't have a body. But yeah, also as an activist, I think, especially here in Berlin, it's interesting to reflect on that because I have a lot of friends that have a lot of back problems because they do a lot of work organizing many things. At the end of the day, you see how their body is and their body is screaming, And so, especially because I'm always giving massages to my friends and those activists, I think more and more my sort of shift of focus has been more towards, the inside, like caring for each other's bodies that are like actively trying to fight against any system of oppression. Like that has consequences on your body. And so I guess for me, more recently, I've been thinking about how can I create a space where people can come together and they can also receive care to their bodies, like people who normally are always giving to a struggle, so that we can have more sustainable struggles or more like ways of fighting in a way where we just don't end up in this like classic cycle of the burned out activist,
Yeah, absolutely necessary. When did you feel like you knew that you had a body?
It was probably around, one of my travels in Asia where I just realized that I am a blob of many things, many emotions, many, flesh, bones, organs, somatic sensations, emotions. My partner, actually, she's a neuroscientist and a meditation teacher. So by learning how to do this type of Buddhist meditations where you focus on your breathing and the present moment, you're always getting in touch with your body and how you are itching somewhere or like you're tickling somewhere, or there is a muscle that is a bit weird, or you have to move. And so there is always this like slight sense of uncomfortability in the body. Our minds are wired to go to fictitious futures or pasts, and we forget about the present moment of our bodies. And so I think, for me at least, the awareness of my body and how I hold emotions in different parts of my body. For example, the other day, my partner was giving me a massage in my legs and quadriceps, And I realized that I held a lot of sadness there. This was after my father had passed away. And I realized that when I got touched there and I got a massage, that I started feeling very sad and often angry and sort of a lot of grief, was stored there at the time. Also, more recently, I've hung out with many comrades here in Berlin who are anarcho-feminists, and they do dance, they do twerk, perreo in Spanish, as a form of struggle in the streets as a protest. And learning from them about the pelvis and how to move the pelvis has been very powerful for me as a way to also work on my own health, internal structures, and just, to liberate parts of the body that I didn't know I even had,
What have you learned about working with the pelvis?
I think it's a tool as part of many tools in the toolbox to fight things like patriarchy and colonization. I find that, I was socialized to be a man, to be a type of masculinity that is not supposed to move those parts of the body because they're not seen as manly or whatever. But I never cared. I was always dancing since I was a kid. So I think for me, it has allowed me to understand many things about creativity. In yoga, some people say that we have this chakra point in this part, where the pelvis is, no? And some people say it's related to both the energy of sexuality and the energy of creativity. And I do find that when you move and you exercise your pelvis, it's kind of like invoking a fire. It's an energy, especially if you do it collectively. You get this very interesting way of directly trying to consummate these energies, which I, in other ways I would do through writing or through playing music. But directly working with the pelvis, for me, has at least allowed me to liberate many emotions, many sensations. And in general, I think that by moving the pelvis more, it allows you to be more in touch with yourself, to be more able to deal with, certain pains that you have. I've been slowly developing that part of my body as a exercise, but also as a form of struggle against the patriarchy, that you can move and have that sexuality, but it doesn't have to mean violence. It doesn't have to mean this sort of patriarchal form of sexuality. It can be a liberating thing just to move in circles, the pelvis, something that men are not supposed to do.
Beautiful. Yeah. When did you become aware of your gender? What is your gender? How has it shifted in your life?
Yeah, it's a good question. I feel like, throughout growing up in Guatemala, I guess I was socialized to be a boy or a man. I had many family members around me who were in the military at the time, and they had this very hegemonic way of being a man, it's very top-down, militaristic way of expressing themselves. And I never really liked it, so I was kind of always against this. And so I think from now I had this unconscious way of trying to find ways of, dealing with emotions. I was always making music, so always writing or always painting, doing things that had to do with what we call art. So I was always trying to find ways of, exploring my own emotions and feelings. I didn't have the concept of what masculinity was at the time. And then I think through the years it shifted, I think. Yeah, I feel like as you grow up and, you start to have relationships with other people and you become desirable because you are a man by women, for example, or by other men, you realize, oh, I'm a guy, I'm a man. What does that mean? I think it was only after I got acquainted with the Kurdish movement that I started thinking more critically about patriarchy and masculinity and what it would mean to free my body and my also understanding my body as mind and body together, because the mind is an emergent property of the body. Yeah, that the sort of what we call colonization, what we call capitalism, all of these things are really rooted in how men treat themselves and understand themselves and how they treat other people. So they are not the worst victim of the patriarchy, but they're definitely the first one. And so for me, what Abdullah Öcalan, one of the leaders of the Kurdish movement, says he talks about killing the dominant men. And by killing, he means it in a metaphysical sense, internally, as in getting rid of this sort of dominant patriarchal masculinity that tries to contradictorily dominate through emotions. So the emotional domination that men do either consciously or unconsciously to other people, to other bodies. Yeah, there's a lot of very interesting reflections there. And I feel like to deal with that, to unweave that, to release that, we have to have many tools. We have to find all the tools that we can, because it's a system that has been passed down to us for thousands of years.
You mentioned before when you went to Taiwan that you had to do sort of code switching. You had to have people believe that you were native English speaker or American.
Cuban migrant in Florida. That was my cover.
So I'm thinking about like at what point you sort of understood your racialization, and especially as this has, I'm sure, shifted regarding the context of where you've been with your body as a migrant.
Yeah, totally. I mean, so ever since I was very young in Guatemala, I was always given many nicknames that had to do with the color of my skin. So there was definitely a lot of colorism and racism that I didn't know how to name. People would call me many names. Also, I mean, children can be horrible at like reproducing these systems, especially in countries like Guatemala that have like a lot of structural forms of colonialism and racism and also patriarchy. So there, I definitely always felt that in the form of bullying, but I learned to laugh it off or to like kind of question it in a way. You know, I would always reply back to people like, "What did you say?" To like make them think a bit about what they're saying.
How did you have the tools to do that? Like, was this just kind of internal, or was it something from your family?
I don't know. I think it's a good question. My mom is a psychologist. She's a educational psychologist, so she teaches teachers how to teach.
So does my mom.
That's great. Yeah. So my mom's a teacher, so she would always ask me questions. Whenever I was, we were going somewhere and walking or doing things, I would ask, "Mom, why is that? Why is this like this?" And she would always ask me, "Why do you think? Think of why." And so that made me ask a lot of questions and keeps me going to today. I always ask many questions, but I think this practice of asking questions to people that you don't agree with or that you agree with I guess I got it from her. But yeah, when I moved to Taiwan, I experienced really hardcore forms of racism there that made me also reflect back on my like previous experiences in Guatemala. Like get on a bus in Taiwan, go to the university, and then there's like a free space next to someone. I sit next to them and I start to feel their uncomfortableness, that they're very tense because they're not used to being next to a person of color. They get nervous, they get afraid, and so you start to feel that. And the moment that there is a free space in the bus, or they leave, all right, or you sit down and they leave immediately. And this was also, of course, not just my experience. Like many of my friends from Tanzania, from the Philippines, Burkina Faso, many countries, they were feeling this in different ways. Yeah, I remember it made me very angry at the time. As I grew older, I got more angry when it came to like racism, because in places like Taiwan, it's in a way more unapologetically racist than in Europe, for example. In Europe, people pretend not to be racist. They say, "Oh no, we've dealt with our colonial past and we have worked on these things." In Taiwan, people don't care. They don't know about it, in the same way. And they even have this imported, I would say, not everyone, of course, but, spoken to people who've told me directly like, "Oh yeah, we come second after the Aryan people, the white people." So they have this very like top-down, supremacist, internalized like racism and also sexism. Like friends from the Philippines would say that they, often in places like Taiwan, a lot of the migrant labor is from Indonesia, from Thailand, from Malaysia, from the Philippines. And, she was studying with me and she was asked always on the street, like, "Hey, you want to work on the kitchen for us? Like on the back of the kitchen? Like we need some basically cheap labor that we can like exploit to like do this thing." So there's definitely a lot of ways in which like the capitalist structures of racism and so on are very much present there, but it's just a very different context.
What got you into this question about universal basic income? Was this an experiential sense that you wanted to go into it, or was it sort of philosophical, or, both?
I think it was many things. So when I was in Taiwan, I was getting a stipend every month. I think it was around $400 at the time. And that experience of receiving an income every month, it was conditional on the fact that I had to study the scholarship, but it gave me this experience of like the types of freedom that people get when they have this money and this time, which of course you can work on top, but if you want like for a wage, but just having this basic security was definitely one of the drivers. Before going to London, I was doing research in Bangladesh, which is now going through a very interesting revolution. At the time, I was interested in trying to critique microfinance, how this sort of story of lending money to the so-called the poor, how people do this type of small entrepreneurial things, it's like a way to, as they say, get people out of poverty, in quotes.
This was very popular in the early 2000s, and yeah, it was kind of getting, like, I was in development studies and sustainable development and looking at some of these microfinances in Nicaragua. And yeah, it seemed to be like, oh yeah, this is it. This is the answer.
Yeah, it's interesting now because I at the time I went to do an interview and also understand how the Grameen Bank works, which was founded by a person called Mohammed Yunus. They even gave him a Nobel Peace Prize. He now became president of Bangladesh, which is very, 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 very strange to think about. But he's actually, I would call him a liberal person, like from an anarchist position. He's very close to the Clinton family and the Clinton administration. He was instrumental in setting up microfinance, not just in Bangladesh, but also in the US and many other countries. And the idea of microfinance is essentially that people get a loan that can be $5, $10, $50, $100 with an interest, and the repayment schedule is often quite fast. So people pay back often, twice as much, 1/3, or, I think the craziest interest rate I remember reading at the time was like 256% of interest in some Mexican microfinance. So I was interested in understanding how people actually use their money in situations where there is a scarcity of cash. So I did a research with a method that was called financial diaries, where I was working with an NGO, a savings NGO, that gave people some like notebooks where they could write down the diary of their money flows.
Okay. And this was cash?
In cash or like credit, like everyday loan credits. And so big gifts, everything from savings, repayments, expenditures, all of these different like categories. I had the chance of analyzing this for like a very small number of people, like 50 people, let's say, over a period of 2-3 years. And it's amazing what you see because it's both qualitative information in terms of the types of relationships that people do with money, like giving them money for someone's marriage, receiving money abroad from your family, paying back a loan, giving credit for a newspaper, stuff like that. But it was also quantitative in terms of the amounts and so on. And one of the interesting things I found at the time was that, contrary to popular belief, most of the debt that people have in contexts where cash is scarce, where people earn very low incomes, is the amount of debt that people have is actually with each other. So the everyday loans, like peer-to-peer loans, like, hey, Kate, I don't have cash today to pay you for the coffee. Like, can I give you tomorrow? Sure, yeah, no problem. Like, this sort of mutualism is very, very much present in not just in Bangladesh, but across, many countries. And so that was a very interesting insight. Like, I think it represented about 1/3 or more of the amount of overall debt that people had. Microfinance is often around the same, like 1/3. And you also see that this formula, this sort of neoliberal, entrepreneurial, austere way of saying, hey, let's give all these loans to people that have been impoverished by capitalism, how it's really not a solution, but actually creates this type of debt trap. People get a loan to pay off another loan. Their whole life is borrowed in so many ways, right? And so this was another driver that got me to think about unconditional basic income, as opposed to this idea of giving micro loans. That was when I was in Taiwan. So when I was in Taiwan, I was doing research in Bangladesh, and it was around those years where I got into the basic income debate, and then we set up like a basic income network in Taiwan with some friends at the time.
What was your experience of setting up that network initially?
It was interesting because it was all very new, I think, at the time. Also for Taiwanese people, we got a bunch of students also to come, and we were also students, so we were all like teaching each other, like learning what we have read or what we have know from different contexts. And so it was interesting because when it comes to like strategies and tactics of how to make basic income happen, at the time we were, at least I was, more thinking about it from the perspective of the state. So how could we fund the basic income by doing tax redistribution, fiscal reform, different types of funds to do basic income, right? And so we made a proposal and then we gave it to some people in the Congress at the time. But in the context of like Taiwan, I remember talking once to Audrey Tang, who is now the digital minister of Taiwan. And she told me that in Taiwan, basic income would not work because people love to work and that people are sort of fine, let's say. Yeah, sure. Taiwan is a very middle high income country, but at the same time, people work a lot. Of course, it's relative if you compare it to other countries in the region, but generally speaking, there is a lot of what the late David Graeber called bullshit jobs. And so in every context, basic income will be different and it will also have different effects. I think for Taiwanese society, it meant a way to slow down maybe in a context where you have hyper-capitalist economy that's producing half of the world's computers.
I'm really interested in this mechanism of self-empowerment or something along those lines, from like, I'm studying, I'm working, to I want to do a project, I want to collectivize, I want to work with other people, and we're empowering each other to actually do this big idea, to take it to Congress. I mean, I think for some people, like, this step is huge. How does one get there?
I think it's a question about the imagination. Like, how can we make basic income happen in the present? I think that was the question that we were asking ourselves, right? And then, it's a question about looking at the reality of what is already there. Like, how is income security, income distribution systems working already? What are the potential mechanisms, the potential forms of redistribution that can happen, right? So then you start to come up with this picture of the context in which you're in, right? As I said, every context is different. Like, we cannot compare the German context to the Taiwanese context, to the Guatemalan context, to the US context. But each of them has their own particularities where you can be like, hey, maybe this is a way to do a basic income here. So I think both at the time I was in the university, but also as an activist, I thought, and it was a collective effort. I was only, also just part of it. Like, how can we make a proposal that makes some sense to the idea, gives some grounds for the debate? And again, I think that was the issue at the time, that we had to go to a politician to be like, hey, we did all this research and here's this vision, this work. But at the end of the day, things like basic income depend on political will. With the pilot we run in Berlin, we did it self-organized with a cooperative, and we had no support whatsoever from the city government.
Is that finished now?
Yes, the pilot started in 2020 and ended around the middle of 2023. We worked with many local producers, merchants, businesses, distributors, care workers in the city and also in Brandenburg, where, both the people and also these merchants will receive basic income given in a digital currency. And so what we did was a program where, the businesses, the farmers and so on, they would sign up to be part of the pilot, and we will give them the promise of giving them euros in exchange for the local currency that they accepted, Circle's UBI, that is issued digitally on a blockchain, as a way to grow the economy. Now, that was the very basic model that we did to set it up. And it was a very interesting process because you see how the goal was to create a circular local economy. And then you see how entrenched sort of the different structures of capitalism and imperialism are in the region. So, for example, when we were working with some farmers in Brandenburg, they would tell us that the tomatoes that they grow, the bio tomato or whatever, are often 50 cents, probably more now, more expensive than the tomatoes that come from Andalusia in Spain, which are grown in a context where there is a lot of also migrant labor and exploitative labor. Farmers here in Germany cannot compete against these prices and against these sort of exploitative imports. And so, even if they have a lot of subsidies. We had last year many protests from farmers that were protesting against the government, called to take out these oil subsidies that they need in order to produce food. So there is a lot of subsidies for oil that allow farmers to grow food at okay prices, but it's artificial. And so even these farmers already receiving a subsidy cannot compete against cheap imports from abroad. And so, with a basic income, one of the goals we had was to get farmers to collaborate, cooperate, and, decrease their costs for sending food to the city. So in Germany, in countries like Brandenburg, there's a lot of these Solavi type of farms. It's a self-organized farm, a smaller farm. They have their own distribution system, their own car. So it's all very individualized. There is no like collective like distribution system. And so all of these types of forms of coordination we were trying to, organize to like help cheapen the cost of producing and distributing food that could be paid through the currency. And so this was kind of like the work we were organizing.
So like the basic income was kind of supplementing this labor of organizing?
To find the linkages between, let's say a farmer might need someone who drives, right? And maybe the farmer can share the car with another farmer. And so we were, as the cooperative, we were like trying to find those links to like get the businesses and the farmers, the merchants, all these people to work with each other and create loops that are mutually beneficial. So the people that got the basic income in Berlin, they use their money to buy food, right? But that's sort of the easy part, let's say. What's really at stake is like what happens behind the scenes, the people who is doing the labor to get the food to the places, and how can the basic income help in that process, right? And I think what I learned is that because of this structure of imperialism that we have, the question of autonomy becomes very important. Like, if there is no autonomy in Europe in terms of food sovereignty, in terms of energy, in terms of many things, then the thrive for extraction and for like getting imports from abroad, from the global south, will not stop.
How do you deal with the limitation of time? I mean, you have this linkages maybe being paid for somehow, the labor of finding that, but like, how do you find the time? If I think about, let's say, the daily life of a farmer, like they probably have enough to do already, right? So right? So like, where does this extra time come from?
Exactly. Yeah, no, that's a great question. So we were always very aware of this in the pilot, like how to make sure that the labor of, doing this pilot, of like getting this benefit and so on, makes sense for them without them having to spend even more time in doing bureaucracy that they already do, because they have to do bureaucracy because we live in Germany, right? So, we had a dedicated group for that. They were called the CATs, which stand for the Community Activation Team. And the CATs were basically internalizing a lot of the administration for many of these partners to like, interface between like German legal bureaucracy, like taxes, invoices, this type of stuff, and then the everyday needs, so that there was a care work, let's say, to like allow these people to be able to come in to this experimental network and try it out. Yeah, because it was a pilot and it was very experimental. We were trying to work with specific businesses that had a specific, volume of stuff that they would do, so that it makes sense for them. It was also a challenge, I think, because, for some people, it nevertheless meant more time that they had to spend, on like figuring out how the thing worked. If a payment didn't go through because of technical problems, you lose time. And so I remember for one specific self-organized distribution collective, it was too much overhead for them, right? So definitely there you see some of the limitations that, this type of system had,
How is giving a universal basic income to like a specific group of people who work in a specific project different than just like generating jobs?
So I think the difference is that when we talk about this generation of jobs, or what it's called as a proposal, a job guaranteed, the idea is often that some person from the government will come up with an industry or a plan to get something going, Nowadays, it's a lot about the green transition and how we're going to transition to so-called green cars with lithium batteries, even though no one thinks about where the batteries come from. Yeah, and then we're going to have workers work to make that transition happen. And so this making of jobs, it's towards the production of a specific industry, right? That has, many limitations, I would say. You have examples from the Soviet Union where people were actually lying to their bosses about the amount of time that they were working. They were working less, but because the idea of the worker was the political subject of places like the Soviet Union, you had to somehow deal with the fact that they created these amazing conditions for people and for workers, where workers were working less. But that was not acceptable because labor was reified so much. It was so important. So when it comes to basic income, the idea is just that people will have the power to say no to different forms of relationships. Say no to a job, say no to an abusive partnership, say no to something in life that you don't want, and to say yes to the things that you want. And so it's about giving people this free time and space, maybe to do other things, to care for life, to care for themselves, for other people. So it's in a way, universal basic income at its most liberatory, I would say, is about unleashing people from the necessity for forced wage labor. So it becomes a choice rather than the human condition.
So did this mean that the people that were working on this project could kind of show up and work as much or as little as they wanted to?
Yeah, if they wanted to, yeah, for sure. I mean, the thing is, for the recipients of the basic income, it was really nice because they could just suddenly have an extra bit of money that they could use to buy food, which helped people in during the pandemic, get to the end of the month, For, let's say, a farmer, it might be useful because then you have access to different services, accounting, distribution, stuff that you normally don't get. So you can lower your costs. So for different people, it meant different benefits, let's say, within the sort of these networks. But like I said, I feel like it was because it was a very small experiment. I think at the peak moment, we had maybe 5,000 people using it. But I would say between 1,000, 2,000 people was the norm during most of the months. I think, yeah, people had more time to do things that they wanted. Or because they had this income, often because we're living in precarious conditions, many of us here, it's this little amount of money, it meant a lot. I remember a friend saying without the Circle's currency this month, I wouldn't have been able to get my groceries. So it was an interesting moment also because of the pandemic, where a lot of jobs went online or people lost their jobs and so on. So there was definitely a need for cash, for having the circulation. So definitely, even if it wasn't full basic income or if it wasn't given to everyone, which is the idea of universal and unconditional basic income, it definitely shows some of these effects that we see also in other places where pilots have been done.
Now it's at an end. What's the effect of them not receiving it anymore?
It's a good question. I feel like for many people, it created a community. So not having that definitely meant some lack, some void. For the businesses, it meant that this extra income that they would get because of people paying in their basic income money was no longer there. So definitely it was seen as for some a loss because, of course, you're thriving, you're doing this, it helps your economy, your local business. So that was definitely a drawback. I saw how some of the businesses that were in the network, after the pilot ended, they just, maybe stopped or took a pause or changed what they were doing. Yeah, and also for the individual people, I think they were looking forward to continuing, getting stuff for their basic income. And so I think the process of making a pilot, it's often very bittersweet because you see all the potentials of it, but because of the pragmatic reality of funding and lack of funding and stuff like that, when it comes to an end, there is this wrapping up that you have to do of the relationships that were built. And
how did previous instances of class division show up in terms of organizing together?
That's a good question because there was, I would say, a very interesting difference between the people who would access the basic income. We call that an open pilot because we didn't have a limit to the amount of people that could join. It was based on trust, on building community at the local level. And so, you had everything from migrant people from South America, from North America, from just different contexts. I remember one business that was, more like a working class person, making her own business. And then suddenly some person that, accessed the application said, hey, I want to buy this food from you. So she prepared it and was waiting for them to pick it up, and they never picked it up, And so also the self-organized collective of distribution was complaining that some of the people that were using the network were middle-class people that were kind of overtaking, let's say. And so that meant that their energy or the work went to them instead of to their own community that they might want to have to support. So there was definitely this interesting class division in terms of the consumption by different people. So at the same time, there were also many working class people who were using circles, but you see that because of the fact that you have a technology that people have to use to like access this thing, that already in itself creates its own like divisions of who can access and who can't, right?
Because it's an app on a phone?
Yeah, it's a phone, it's a digital application, right? Like normally with basic income, the ideal is that it should be given in cash, right? That's the best. And we tried to make this application to see how it will work at a digital level. The businesses themselves, as I said in the subsidy program that we had, they still got euros to their bank accounts in exchange for the circles that they accepted. But the payment to those businesses was done in the circle's local currency.
Okay, and the local currency was called Circles, or it was
Circles UBI, yeah.
So you're writing a book now. You're just finished. I don't know.
Soon, hopefully, yeah.
Where are you at now with your thinking, with your writing?
So I'm in the last months of trying to finish a book that is called Decolonizing Money. It's a short book that argues for the abolition of the United States dollar and for the introduction of a worldwide cancellation of debt that whole nations, people have to institutions like the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and others, and also for the introduction of a basic income, I call it a liberatory income for all of people. So the argument in the book is that we cannot really transition to a more socially just and ecological world unless we get rid of the dollar, because the dollar is this currency by which all debt and most of debt and trade is denominated. There is the petrodollar system, which is a system where to buy oil today, which is the main energy source of the planet, still, you can only do it with dollars. It's a deal that they made back in the 70s with Saudi Arabia and other countries. And so what this means is that we cannot, change even the energy grid properly, because the dollar maintains this regime, which is defended and also funds the United States Army, which has military bases all over the world. I mean, Germany has the second biggest amount of military bases in the world. Japan, I think, has the first. So the central banks of the world have to hold US dollars in order to maintain the power purchase of their own currencies. And so because we live in a system where, all these countries are effectively paying tribute to the United States in the form of money, but also in the form of resources, similar to how, Berlin farmers struggle with imports from South to compete. Also in the US, like there is a big import of, the US cannot go at it alone, basically. It needs the resources of the planet to maintain itself. So it's a very extractive system, a very extractive being. And so I say that, if we want to really transition and have both an ecological and socially just transition, we have to abolish the dollar. Even things like the genocide in Palestine now, that is funded by U.S. money and U.S. weapons to the Israeli state. So, all these linkages that have to do with ecocide, with genocide, are all interrelated in one way or another to the dollar. So what I'm trying to argue is that we need to move to a system that actually recognizes the, bioregional differences that exist in each region, and move on to a system that follows more in this anarchist line of a municipalist democratic basic income, so that every local place can have its basic income and exchange with other places and build autonomy from the bottom up. It's an anarchist vision, so I don't argue for it from the perspective of the state. So that of course makes things a bit more interesting. But the proposal is that by having a debt cancellation, because of the abolition of the dollar, people will suddenly have a lot of freed up wealth that they can then use for other things. Part of that could be basic income, but it's a way to also connect with struggles, for example, for prison abolishment, which is the other side of the coin of the monetary system. Now, the police, the army are funded by the taxation from the government. And so what I'm arguing for is that by focusing our strength to take direct action against the dollar, we can then also have an intersectional struggle against the prison regime and the military-industrial complex.
What are those steps from coming where we are to going to this vision?
So in the last chapter of the book, I talk about methods, messing with the border regime, going against the militarization. We need to completely abolish the monetary institutions of the United States, the Federal Reserve, as well as the Treasury locally, but internationally it also means the IMF, the World Bank, because if you see it as a global system, also the central banks of all the other countries in the world are kind of like nerve endings, appendages of the dollar. No, they serve as a way to continue this super imperialist system. And so abolition of the institutions, creation of democratic counter institutions, sabotage in the form of counterfeiting, in the form of recuperation of funds, of money, like to do direct action.
For someone who right now is earning their living in dollars and they don't have a lot of extra time, how do we convince this person out of like the fear that might come over thinking about the abolishment of the dollar? What's on the other side of that?
So one of the things I say in the book is that we have to abolish the dollar, but keep its unit of account. So today, most things are priced in dollars. Whenever you think of any other currency, you always say, how much is that in dollars, right? It's like the power to define what the one is, no? Like if you think of money as a measurement metric, what we should do is say, let's abolish all these imperialist institutions and keep the measurement unit as a way to do a transition. So people then can receive their basic income and, other forms of support in that system of metrics. So it's not like the amount of energy, let's say, that it takes to maintain the dollar today will basically shift towards the energy that will be given to people. So for anyone that doesn't have time or that depends on the dollar, I think it's important to tell them that they can still receive basic income support, to be taken care of and be cared for with dignity. It's just that the institutions that maintain the system of extraction will no longer be there. So I think it's a bit of a magic trick to say, like you still get your basic income in your local currency. That will be in the same numbers as we think about dollars, as a way to have a transition. But what you think of the dollar today will cease to exist,
What's the hardest aspect of collectivizing and getting people to work together?
Well, that's a good question. I feel like, for me, I think it's a question of getting people to understand the importance of it, of why we need to abolish the dollar, because it's often not even a topic of discussion, because we think about climate change, we think about colonialism, we think about patriarchy, and these are all real systems, but they're all embodied through the value system of capitalism, which is today coined in US dollars. So the argument I'm trying to make is that in order to change the value system of capitalism or destroy it, we need to blow up its currency. And so I think getting people to understand that this is a way to bring other world with a different value system into being. Like capital is always opposed to life. Life is a different value system. Like the caring for life, it's diametrically opposed to capital. Capital thrives by colonizing life. And so by attacking directly the capitalist money of the hegemonic capitalism today, which is the US dollar, I argue that we can change the rules and make a system that allows for the caring of life, specifically through debt cancellation and a basic income. As I was saying, gives people the time and the space to care for themselves and say no to relationships of domination.
When you're finished with your book, well, maybe not when you're finished with your book, let's even just say tomorrow, the near future tomorrow, where are you putting your body that brings you joy?
So in the short term, for sure, here in the spaces that I organize in, I have a punk band. It's called Veritan, hardcore punk band. And we do a lot of work in terms of the scene. The so-called punk scene is today plagued by anti-Deutsch people who are Zionists, pro-Israel imperialists. And so that's for me a direct struggle of fighting in the scene, doing a real punk movement. So I put my body there. Also in some spaces, self-organized spaces that I am part of, in events, cooking, doing solidarity actions, massages, as I was saying. A lot of massages I want to give and receive, teach people how to give them and sort of collectivize this knowledge. It's something that I want more of. Then hopefully in the not so near future, also in Guatemala, I would love to be there as well. I'm a bit concerned about the rise of fascism in this country, and I don't know how longer is it sustainable to stay here.
You just heard from Julio Linares, an economic anthropologist who, in his first book, Decolonizing Money, which will be out on Pluto Press in 2025, argues for the abolition of the US dollar as a means to transform the distribution of wealth and power on the planet in order to bring forth a social, ecological, just transition. I'm Mad Kate, and you've been listening to S.W.E.A.T, a series of conversations about performance and performativity of the sexual and sexualized body and work. The theme music was composed by me and features the voice of performer and actress Lori Baldwin. S.W.E.T airs every second Tuesday of the month at 13 hours Central European Time on Colaboradio, Free Radios Berlin Brandenburg, broadcasting on 88.4 FM in Berlin, 90.7 FM in Potsdam, and streaming online at fr-bb.org. Afterwards, it's available for streaming wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks so much. Until next time.